Welcome to the SpiritWoke podcast, podcasting from the beautiful city of Stillwater, the birthplace of Minnesota. Are you going through a spiritual awakening? Do you wish to learn more about continued spiritual growth and want to meet others who are on a similar journey? We hope that this podcast and its community can be a meaningful resource for you. The SpiritWoke podcast welcomes special guests from around the globe who share personal stories of their awakening journey, along with details of spiritual abilities they've developed along the way. So buckle up and get ready for this exciting episode. And now, here's your host, Adam Dins.
Friends, welcome back to the SpiritWoke podcast. Today we welcome quantum life coach extraordinaire Amber Wippel to the cast. Amber refers to herself as a small-town girl from Jewett, Texas, who had a really minimal understanding of life outside that town. Life opened up for Amber in a very peculiar way a few years ago after a meaningful spiritual awakening, and knows that it is her mission to help others reach their maximum potential in life. Amber believes that we are all limitless, and she must share that knowledge the universe has given her with others to help them better understand themselves and their potential. That being said, Amber, welcome to the podcast.
Good morning. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing very well. Thank you so much for getting up at the crack of dawn to talk spirituality with us on the SpiritWoke podcast.
Yes, absolutely. I'm looking forward to it.
Yes, me too. I've been looking forward to this conversation since we first decided to do it. So, and in saying that, Amber, we've had a lot of guests on our show. And what I like to do with our guests the first time that they're on is to ask them about their spiritual awakening experience, because I know that everybody has a different experience, right? And, for those who are new, who are listening to the show today to spiritual awakenings, sometimes, it's good for them to hear that they're not alone, and that even though my spiritual awakening isn't like, X person or Y person, it still fits into the tapestry of the overall experience. And so, Amber, long way to go about getting to our first question, which is, can you tell our listeners a little bit about your spiritual awakening?
Yeah, it was a wild ride for me that I did not expect. I was in a terrible place. I worked in oil and gas for 10 years. We went through several layoffs. I was watching my friends get let go. My home life wasn't going so good. I was just in a really rocky spot. And I went to the doctor for a cough, and she prescribed me depression medication. And that shocked me, right? I didn't see that coming. So I went home, looked at those pills for a few weeks, and said, no, I'm not going to do that. So I took it online, and I found meditation. So I said, you know what, let's just try this meditation. Let's see how it goes. I've never done it before. I have no idea what it is. And once I did that, I think I did it at 4:30 in the morning. And I think about 5:30, I was driving to work, and I had this burst of energy in my stomach that I could not explain. I pulled my car over. I had tears running down my eyes. And for the rest of the day, I was like, what was that? And that spiraled me on a journey that has blown my own mind. So that was what happened, but what happened after that was the fun part.
So Amber, let's talk about that. So you went from kind of just living this earthly life, right? Doing your 8 to 5, going to work, having your family life at home, and in an instant, right? Like in the snap of a fingers, Everything changed. Everything changed immediately.
It was all of a sudden I had awareness of all the mistakes that I had made, everything that took me down a wrong path. I was highly aware of that. So I was in a moment of looking at myself going, how do I dig myself out of this? Because I had awareness of everything I had done that probably wasn't in my best interest, right? Wow, let's fix this. And it happened immediately. Depression was lifted off of me. Anxiety was lifted off of me overnight. It was the wildest thing I've ever experienced.
Wait, Amber, let's go back a second. So you said that in that instant, you had awareness of everything that you had done wrong in your life. Like, what does that mean? Like, how did that appear to you?
Well, I had looked very closely at the decisions that I had made to get me to the point to where I was. I realized every single decision that took me to the place that I was at. And I had to, first of all, take that in, because that was a big chunk of information to be thrown at me. And then I had to realize, okay, well, how do I fix it? But it was just immediate awareness of all the things that I may have not made the best decisions. So that was a little bit heartbreaking for me to see, really.
So were you sitting in your car when this happened, or did this come later in the day?
When I was sitting in my car, I had the burst of energy. All the information flowed in a day or two later.
Okay, so it was a little bit over time. You just started getting this information coming in, and you started processing it. And how did you process that information? Because I can imagine, here you get diagnosed with depression, right? And you get some medication to take for that. And then you have this sort of awakening experience. And then you get home and you get these visions of all the things that maybe led you to the place where you are in life, right? And so it's like sad stuff, right, with the depression, then like this joy with the awakening, and then you start seeing this other stuff that maybe lean more towards the sad side too, right? So, so two questions for you on that. So how did you like deal with that? Seeing those things that were maybe not so positive that you needed to change, and two, if you were to compare that to how you would have dealt with it before your awakening, so let's say you had all of that information come to you before your awakening versus afterwards, how do you feel like you were able to deal with it versus in your earlier life?
First of all, the amount of information that was coming to me, I will tell you, was overwhelming, and it was sad. And you're right, there was a lot of sad moments that I had to deal with, because it linked all the way back to some of my childhood. If it would have happened, I would have gotten that information before the awakening. I probably would have ignored it. Minus afterwards, I had no choice. It was very clear and in my face. So there were no options. It was for me to tackle right then. I knew it. I just absolutely knew I had to take it on. And some of the stuff linked back to, my mom passed away when I was 16 years old. Things that I had kind of shoved down and didn't deal with because I didn't know how, right? Sometimes in life, we're not taught the skills to understand such traumatic things. My mom died when I was 16. I didn't have the skills to deal with that. I had no idea. So I kept shoving it down. But I can tell you the universe pushed me and forced me to deal with it immediately. And I got chills when I said that. I mean, it was immediate. Within a week or two, I was diving in.
Yeah, those traumas, life, we don't come consciously prepared with the skills to deal with those types of traumas, and I it's interesting, a really common thread amongst people who experience an awakening that I've talked to, that our guests that our listeners have listened to on this podcast, people who've gone through these incredible awakenings like you have experienced a pretty significant level of trauma in their lives, and they get to a point where it's just, a breaking point. They get to, they hit rock bottom, if you will. And so you experienced earlier in your life the loss of your mother, and then you had other things after that, obviously, that just kind of piled on top of it, right?
Sure.
And so that diagnosis of depression, may have been that last spiritual straw, right? But it's interesting because it's not like, I think some people who aren't familiar with spiritual awakenings and they just see people who are living this beautiful spiritual life, kind of look at it from a different perspective, and that, wow, look at how happy they are and look at how peaceful and how strong they are. And I don't think that a lot of people who haven't experienced this realize how much work it is, like how much, it's like if you're going to put this is a terrible analogy, but if you're going to put a fence in the yard, right, you got to take the shovel and dig out the stuff, the dirt, and get it all up. And so you can, it's very similar in an awakening. You got to dig a lot of stuff up, and you have to,
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that sounds like that's exactly what happened to you.
Absolutely. And, sometimes the universe doesn't give you a choice. It puts it right in your face, and you just have to start digging in. And I can tell you, I went to the depths of my soul to find all of it. And yeah, you're right. Absolutely. That people say she's so happy, but I'm going to tell you, it takes some work to get there and to understand yourself at almost a cellular level of where those things are stored in your body. You have to release them out. We're 99.999% space, right? We're not meant to hold these traumas that we have. They're meant to come and go, and we're meant to process them, right? And instead, most humans hang on to them when in fact, they're meant to just release. But we're not taught that in schools. Most people don't understand that. I know I did not. I'm sure a lot of people do, but at that point in my time, I did not understand it at all.
Yeah, and I want to dig a little bit deeper here. And in all fairness to those listening in, Amber and I have had many conversations before this podcast about her story. And there's something that Amber hasn't shared that I want her to go into a little bit here. So Amber, you shared with me that after you had this spiritual awakening experience, you did something very brave. And, I really respect this about you, that you literally took a year off of life. Like you said, I'm done with the way I'm doing things, and I need to sort of get myself to a place where I'm able to move forward in this new direction. And so would you mind sharing a little bit of that with our audience? Because I think it's a really key, important part of your story.
Absolutely. So when I had that awakening for a year, I was preparing to quit my job, sell our house, build another house. We just had so much going on. And so we got all of that accomplished. I was able to quit my job. And my goal was up front to sit by myself for a year. Now, granted, my husband's here and I have 3 little puppies, but for the most part, 8 to 5 when my husband's gone, I spent time meditating, sometimes 3 or 4 hours a day. I really went inside as far as I could possibly go. And I can tell you that's where the magic happens in your life, when you just stop and you let things come in and out. You don't try to understand everything. You just be, right? And I think that's important for people to do if they can do it. Because for me, it was life-changing, because once I spent that, it was 9-10 months, close to a year. Once I spent that time alone, I was able to grow out of that situation I was in. It was important for me to do. I spent meditation. I spent time in nature. I spent time hanging out with my dogs. I just started living like what I wanted to do every day. I just started doing that. And then once that happened, a rebirth almost happens. You're in a spot to where you can see everything clearly, and then you focus on what you really want in life, right? And then you just climb up and you grow from there. And that's exactly what I've done. I really, really appreciated my husband for that time, that he was able to keep working, that he was able to provide that for us. I was very lucky.
Yeah, that's so deep. When I went through my spiritual awakening, I was fortunate enough to go through mine, at least have kind of that call it breakthrough moment a couple of days before we had 2 weeks off for the holiday break at work. And so much like you, I only had 2 weeks, right?
Right.
Which I think is probably more than most people are fortunate enough to have, because
absolutely.
But even in that 2 weeks, I did very similar things to you. Like I just meditated for 2 weeks, and I hadn't really meditated before then, but I knew something in my soul, my spirit said that this was the way to grow. And so I meditated, and I had tried before that as well. Like I had always tried to meditate. I'd have an app here or there, and I'd do the 5-minute, intro guided, and maybe the first day was fine. And then when we got to 7 minutes, I'm like, okay, this is boring. I don't want to do this anymore, And then, but after that breakthrough moment during the awakening, I started at like 30 minutes. It's like, what? Like 30 minutes went by in a second, and I found life changing so profoundly and so quickly in those 2 weeks. But I hear your story. And I think if I had a year to take off, like if I could have just made that decision at that time to like, hey, you know what? I'm going to keep this 2 weeks going. that would have been phenomenal.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, with our culture and our society, we don't have that kind of time, unfortunately. So I do realize that I was super blessed to have that. I wish I could provide that for everybody, really, because to me, it was life-changing to have that 3 or 4 hours today to sit alone by myself in nature, to understand myself, because you're not quite taught who we actually are. And I think that was just important for me to have that time for my studies, for my reading, for my meditations. And honestly, I wish I could grant that for everybody.
Yeah, understood. But I also feel like we all have our own journey, right? And
absolutely.
And maybe not everybody is supposed to have that year to do it. And
absolutely.
And I think some people have that year later. Like everything happens when it's supposed to. And so, so one last question before we actually dive into the topic that we have on planned for today around quantum physics and spirituality. So you mentioned in that year time that you were meditating 3 times a day, and just for not 3 times a day, but for 3 hours at a time or so. So there may be folks listening in who are like, oh, what kind of meditation were you doing? Were you doing transcendental, or were you trying different types?
So I did do transcendental. That's what sparked my that burst of energy in my stomach. But I've really just done from then on what felt comfortable for me. So I have done binaural beats. Sometimes I just sit in complete silence and go in deeper meditations than with binaural beats. I really just do whatever I feel called to do that day. I just listen to my intuition. And if you listen to your intuition close enough, it tells you exactly what to do for each day. That's what I found.
I hear that. Great advice. Thank you for that, Amber. So, Amber, when you first shared your awakening story with me, I thought, wow, this is a deeply mystical experience, when you had that explosion in your stomach and you started seeing these things, right? But as you explained, when we spoke on the phone, I learned that your understanding of the universe is much more scientifically than, say, or I should say more scientifically based than, say, some of the New Age points of views or the spiritualist points of views, which is very heavy on the spiritual side. And there's some science in there, but you really kind of like root yourself in quantum physics. And so how can you explain to our audience how quantum physics has influenced your spirituality?
Absolutely. So immediately after that awakening, I was urged to understand quantum physics. And I remember thinking back then, when I got that information in my mind, go study quantum physics, I was thinking, what? You don't have the right person. Because I was not a science person at all. So I remember being so intimidated and thinking, can I do this? And you know what? I just kept going, no matter what. If I got the call to do it, I was going. So I kind of submerged myself into quantum physics to the point, and I didn't quite think I was going to understand it, but to my surprise, I understood it fully. Maybe not to other people's level, but I can assure you, like in myself, I understood it for what it was. And it's mind-blowing because you start to realize nothing is concrete. And that was really what I took away from that. And in quantum physics, everything is limitless. You are limitless. And then you realize the cells in your body are the same things that quantum physics is explaining, right? And you realize, wait a minute, I'm limitless. And I can do anything I want at this point. And you start to realize, oh, wow, my beliefs are holding me back. My own thought patterns are holding me back. And once I started to break my own self down and my own psyche down, and you start kind of going through those beliefs, why do I believe this? Why is it affecting my life in this way? And once you start breaking that down, you start to realize, oh, I was holding myself back the entire time.
So can you explain to those on listening in who may not be familiar with quantum physics, like what is that? Like if you were to explain it to a lay person on the street with no scientific background, how would you articulate quantum physics to them? Quantum
physics is basically everything at a cellular level, which includes us, it includes nature, it includes everything in the entire universe. So you start to realize, we're a part of nature, but everything is at a cellular level. And that's atoms, electrons, protons. And once you understand how they work, you start to realize, our minds maybe sometimes go a little out of control from where they should be. and you start to kind of get wrapped up in your own stuff a little bit. But again, quantum physics is nothing more than us at a cellular level and how those atoms start to react with each other.
Yeah, and react when you have thoughts, right? And
exactly.
Yeah, how those thoughts and emotions, because, you know, when we think about it from a spiritual perspective, right? Like, because I kind of find myself like a hodgepodge of things in between, like New Age Buddhism and this quantum idea, right? Like I don't really go down any particular swim lane. I kind of pick a lot from a lot of different things. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
From the spiritualist perspective, when we look at thoughts, right? Like we know that negative thoughts affect our vibration. And, you know, if we're not vibrating, if we're vibrating at a lower level, it opens us up to a lot of things, or it keeps us from a lot of things, number one, right? It keeps us from accessing higher dimensions and different spiritual abilities. But then it also welcomes in those entities that vibrate at that lower level. But where you're coming from is, in a sense, with quantum, is that, you know, the science of it is that when we have these thoughts, it affects our DNA, it affects our cellular construction, which once you start changing the way your body is constructed, whether it be negatively or positively, right, you have different sort of life experiences.
Absolutely. And I've ran tests on this. So during, you know, the past few years of my life, I ran experiments for 2 years solid. I ran experiments on myself, on my dogs, on my husband. You start to realize once you change your inner reality, how you feel, how your thoughts are, how anything you're thinking or feeling will change your outer reality. And now it doesn't do it in an instance where you see it immediately, but I can tell you, once you start making those shifts within your internal world, your external world will shift around. You will notice people start being nicer to you. You will notice that everything works a little bit more in your favor versus, you know, if you're walking around with a negative attitude, the world's against you, right? You start to learn the universe works for you and through you, and it's not happening to you.
Yeah, it's so deep, you know, and there's so many different levels to the quantum conversation. You know, like I know you listen to Alan Watts also. I've become a huge fan of Alan Watts. I sort of like live off of his words. It's like food for me, you know, and I love his, you know, because we talk about things being an illusion, right? And that what we see is an illusion. And I know there are people who will go, well, no, it's not, you know, like I see what's out there, right? I see what's out there. And I love when Alan Watts said this, it just kind of like changed the way I see everything in general. Which is like when you look outside with your eyes, you know, you think what you're seeing is outside, but what you're really seeing is happening in your head, right? Because we see these reflections coming in, this light that travels into our eyes, and it's our eyes and our brain that processes what we're seeing. So what actually looks like is out there is actually happening in the head. And so when you understand that everything is actually being visualized, being processed, being seen in your head, and you're not actually like seeing what's out, it's just kind of mind blowing because that this really is, even though it seems like it's outside of us and we can touch it and we can touch what we're seeing, what we're really seeing, even us touching it and even us feeling what we're touching is all being processed in our heads, which is just like mind blowing. Absolutely.
And it's absolutely right. When you get down to the quantum cells of us, it's all a bit of an illusion, and I've learned our senses also can't be fully trusted. They just can't be fully trusted because it's only, again, like you said, you're processing it. Your thoughts, your beliefs are projecting all of it. So I've even been in situations to where someone saw something and then I didn't, you know, so our senses can't be quite 100% trusted either. You know, so you learn pretty quickly everything is an illusion. But then when you know that, you go in your inner world to make sure it's on point, to make sure you're at least living this outer experience properly.
Yeah, it's funny how the mind does that. I remember, oh gosh, maybe it was like a month ago, and this sounds absolutely ridiculous, but I was running through one of our nature trails here, and as I was looking down the path, I saw what appeared to be a lobster. And I'm like, how is there a lobster in the middle of this path? And then as I got closer to it, and this happened very quickly, it wasn't a long pronounced like, oh, it's a lobster for 5 minutes, But
Right.
as I came upon it, I noticed they were just these leaves that were organized in a way, and they weren't green leaves. They were kind of brown and orangey leaves. But they looked, when I got upon them, and they didn't look anything like a lobster, but I swear for a millisecond, I thought it was a lobster. My brain just totally played a trick on me. And I know we all have these experiences in life where we see things and then all of a sudden it's not what we thought it was. And it's like, oh, wow, like I can't believe like my brain works that way. But if your brain can show you those things, imagine, and you're able to realize them, what things aren't we realizing that we're being shown that isn't actually real, right?
Absolutely. There was a situation that I have to bring up that I was at home and I had a few friends over and we were all sitting outside, and my dog came outside for a minute and I put her back upstairs, and I saw that the downstairs, our office door was open. So I went to close it. And when I did, all three people yelled at me that the dog was in the office. And I was like, in my head, I was thinking, no, I just put her upstairs, but they all saw it. They all saw my dog run into my office and she wasn't there. So when that happened, I was like, whoa, it was a big eye opener for me that we're not all seeing the same things in life.
No, we're so not. And it's almost, yeah, well, we could go and deep dive on this and talk for hours and hours and hours. But one thing I'd love for you to touch on, Amber, is you mentioned that you conducted some experiments over the 2 years. And would you mind sharing what was an experiment that you conducted that just kind of blew your mind?
I did so many of them because I was reading all this quantum world, right? And so I was like, I've got to try this out. I can't go on without trying this out. So one of them is I purposely put myself in a group of people that I knew were not high vibration. I knew that they were, probably, I don't want to say they were bad people, just in a lower vibration. And I submerged myself into that group for a short amount of time, and then I watched changes within myself. And those changes were dramatic. I noticed my self-worth go down. I noticed my self-confidence go down. And so I'm recording all of this, right? And so I pulled myself out of that situation, and I submerged myself into a group that was super high vibing, very positive people. And then what happened to me, I skyrocketed. My confidence came back up. Everything about me just went back to high vibe. And that was mind-blowing to me to realize that I could be around one or two wrong people and it could pull me completely down. And that was a little bit of a soul shaker because you start to just be very careful who you allow in your life. And I did not realize that.
Yeah, and I love that you shared that particular experiment, because my next question ties directly into that concept. So, how do you believe quantum laws explain our connection to each other?
The only one that makes sense to me so far is string theory. We are all connected at a cellular level. We are all waves and particles, right? And once you understand that, you start to realize, okay, my thoughts and emotions could affect somebody across the universe, and they will, right? So if you have this idea of, oh, I would like to start a podcast, right? You're going to start people coming in to come and help you do that. And so you start to realize, whoa, I'm controlling a little bit of this universe. And we all tie together. Everything that we do will affect somebody else. So my thoughts and advice to everybody is just to make sure you're doing it in a positive manner, because we are all connected. We are 100% affecting each other. And I think that that's a very important thing to know, because it makes you stop and think, what I'm doing right now, will that be for the better of humankind, or will that hurt someone? To me, it's a big deal.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's interesting because I find that for me, and this is interesting because I hadn't thought about this before until right now, I've noticed that when I am doing something intentionally to get a specific result, with sort of the goal of getting a specific result, it doesn't necessarily manifest itself. But when I do something just because it's out of joy and I just want to do it and see what happens. Then I tend to see it. So a really good example of that is the podcast, right? So when Spirit gave me the idea for the podcast, I didn't have any goals of monetizing it, of getting sponsors, of doing any of that stuff. I just wanted to create something that provided value to listeners that we could all learn from guests like you, and have fun and just make it, just something enjoyable, art, if you will. I'm not a master painter or drawer or anything like that, but this is part of my art. So, but as soon as I decided to do that, a buddy of mine, as soon as he learned, he's like, oh, let me share with you all of because he has a podcast. Let me share with you all of the tools that I use, the microphone, the mixer, the software. I'm like, oh, cool. He sent me a list of stuff to buy. And then a friend of mine's boyfriend, he was like, hey, if you need some help producing your podcast, I'd love to do that for you. I'm like, really? You do that for me? He goes, oh, yeah, I'd love to do that. It'd be great. And so all of these people. And then I was like, well, I don't even know, because I was still relatively new into the spiritual community at that point, and I didn't really know anybody that I could ask to be on the podcast. All of a sudden, like, people started coming out of the woodwork on social media, and it's like, wow. And so I wasn't really trying.
Nope.
I was doing a little bit, I'm not going to say I'm just sitting here waiting for things to fall into my lap, but I also wasn't like breaking my back to make life happen.
You don't have to try very hard. If you have something with a pure intention and that feeling and emotion behind it, because you were just doing it for fun and play, right? It's something that you just actually wanted to do. And once you start doing that, the universe will support you 110%. There's really not a lot of hustle and grind for you to do. And I wish I could just, a lot of people in this day and age are still hustle, grind, make all that money, and that's something that bothers me because it's not necessarily true.
Yeah, absolutely. And you recommended a book for me to read, which I've gotten, I'd say 3/4 of the way through. It's called The Divine Matrix by Greg Braden. And it's a really interesting book on quantum physics and how, we can manifest through quantum. And I recommend that book to anyone listening. Again, it's called The Divine Matrix by Greg Braden. It's a very simple or easy to understand book. And, because I'd listened to a lot of quantum before and it just was way over my head. And this book has been fairly easy to digest. But one of the things that Greg talks about in his book, which is really interesting, and it's actually kind of, I would say, maybe even hard to implement, right? Because Greg talks about how when we want to manifest through quantum and leverage those laws of quantum physics, that we have to do so when there's something that we want, when there's something that, we want to achieve or accomplish, we have to, one, act or behave or believe as though that thing has already happened, right?
Absolutely. And
so not just, a lot of times when we pray for things, for example, right, we may say, God, please provide for me a ... right?
Right.
And when we're behaving that way or praying that way, we're acting as if we don't have it. We're feeling as though we don't have it, right? But then the second piece of what Greg says is that we also have to, whatever that intention is, also has to be without ego.
Absolutely, yes.
And that to me is like that first part of wanting something or behaving as though we already have it seems like it's hard enough, right? But to do so without ego, like that just seems so hard to do, right? Because our egos, whether even sometimes unconsciously our egos at work, and so that's I with the podcast, I absolutely saw there was no ego, there was none of that, because I was just kind of on autopilot. But for those who are trying to manifest more out of their dreams, things that they really want, how, like, I don't know, Amber, what are your thoughts on that? Like, how do you pull your ego out of things?
My thoughts on that is it's pretty simple. I think it's, don't overthink. Like, keep your mind a little bit at bay, right? So if you have a thought or a thought and emotion, like if something came up like, hey, I wanted to start my life coaching business. that was coming from my heart. I wanted to help people. So I think if you can, articulate, is it coming from my heart or is it coming from the thoughts in my head? Mine was definitely from my heart, and I had no attachment to the end. And then it's believing, the universe just has my back. It's gonna support me 110%. And I think when you come from that place, things are a little bit simpler. I think the key is not to overthink. And when you get that idea and just act upon it, there's no time for your ego to come in, right? If you're just acting upon that emotion, like, oh my goodness, I want to help people and I have the tools to do it. And so I think if you come from that spot, you're solid.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the question I asked you about how quantum laws explain our connection to each other, I'm always fascinated by it. It always reminds me when I think about how we're connected to each other, that I can't remember what the name of the experiment was, but where there was the photon of light that was projected and it was a particle, right? It was just a particle of light, if you will. And it was going through a barrier that had two holes in it, right? And so the idea was to, actually, I'm thinking of the wrong experiment. The experiment I'm thinking of is where they took, I think it was an electron, and they split the electron in half.
Yep.
And and it became like two electrons, and they sent those electrons 14 miles in separate directions.
Yes.
And the behavior of one of those electrons affected the other electron that was 14 miles in the other direction. And they both started behaving the same way. The behavior of one became the same exact behavior of the other. And so I think that ties into your point of view of how, like when we think things or we're around people that have those negative, maybe aren't as positive or maybe a little bit more at a lower vibration or higher vibration, how that can affect us.
Absolutely. And that is basically quantum entanglement, at its finest, that, when you're around those people, you entangle with those people, and their energy is going to be, your energy and their energy will kind of mix up a little bit. And so, yeah, when you think about it, it's mind blowing, right? It's all mind blowing, but absolutely, we all affect each other. And that's why it's important to be at our very best at all times, and everybody has days. I get that, but I think for the, 90%, like we need to try to focus and make sure we're doing proper things.
Yeah, absolutely. And it also reminds me too of like, and not just how people are connected to each other, because we like to think of people as one, like classification of the universe, and then plants, trees, the sky, the stars is something outside of us. And it's really not, right? And I go back to Dr. Wayne Dyer years ago before I went through my awakening, but I was watching him as a kid on TV once. And I remember him saying, if you take a grain of sand and you break it down to its most rudimentary particle, and you do the same thing with a human cell, it's actually the same exact components.
Absolutely.
We're all made out of the same stuff, Yep. And it just was so mind-blowing for me at that time. I didn't know. I remember I was a kid. I didn't really know what to do with that. But I would tell everybody, I heard this thing on the TV, Dr. Dyer, and here's what Dyer said. And yeah, it's always been so fascinating to me, the whole science and the quantum aspect of it, for sure.
Yeah, we're all made of atoms, right? The whole universe is made of atoms, and what atoms are pretty much empty space. And you start to realize, hey, I'm not exactly who I thought I was, right? Because you grow up, you go through childhood, you collect all these patterns, and then, if you're lucky enough, you're able to release those patterns and just really shine. And I believe firmly that's what we're meant to do.
Yeah, for sure. And I love Eckhart Tolle in A New Earth. He has this. He speaks about when we look out into the sky at night and we see the stars and we're fascinated by what we see. We're not necessarily fascinated by the stars and the planets, but we're fascinated by the space around it, that empty space. And he says, and the reason why we do that is because it mirrors us inside, and that we are much like space, and that most of us on the inside are. It's emptiness, it's space, but it's not really emptiness and space, right? There's there's something there, as Alan Watts would say, there is no such thing as nothingness.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's powerful.
Yeah, it's super powerful. And, and what you learn over time is, the universe moves through you. And if you allow it just to move through without any expectations, without any resistance, you will live a beautiful life if you just allow it to move through you. Yeah,
you're so right. And I think that is whether you kind of believe in quantum or you tend to lean more on the, the spiritualist side, where you're more inclined to think of angels and spirit guides and those types of things. I think that one of the key things, to your point, Amber, that you just made that ties all of these things together is the concept of surrender.
Absolutely. And I think surrender is a huge deal. And in my awakening, that's one thing I learned, just to surrender into it. Because even when I had looked at myself and I realized what a mess I had made, I looked back and I'm like, you know what? It's still all perfect. It's still all perfect. But you know what? Now it's time to release all this stuff. And I think, it's what we're meant to do.
Yes, for sure. And this just came to me as you were saying that if we could look at our future with the same perspective that we have on our past, how much easier would it be to surrender?
Absolutely, 110%.
So, Amber, you are a quantum life coach, and I would love to ask you, how do you use quantum physics to help your clients?
So this was so exciting. And, the fun part is I've done it on myself. I've tested all my theories, so I know what works. And the fun part is you peel back layers within yourself, right? You realize what you are not. And I've had to do that for myself to understand it in others too, because we're all the same, right? There's nothing different between you or I or anybody else in this universe. We're all exactly the same. As society has put so many layers on top of us of we should be this way, or we should wear these certain clothes, or we should just be a certain way. And I find that we can't be that. We cannot be what society wants us to be. And you have to start peeling back the layers of who we are not, because we're none of those things. We are absolutely none of those things that society projects onto us. And I think it's important for people to know that that's okay. We don't have to be that, and we can be ourselves. We can be whoever we want to be. We don't have to be that projected image. And so I think with life coaching, I don't help anybody, first of all, but I do. They speak to me, and I hand it all back to them and say, now, is this you? Is this actually you? And most of the time they're going to say, no, none of that is me. I'm not my past experiences. I'm not my body. I'm not my thoughts. And once people understand that, they can really pull into themselves and say, well, you know what, who am I? And then that's where the journey begins. And then I walk people through that, and it's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. And the fun part for me is I learned something through every one of those people. And that is amazing to me. And I'm so blessed to do this job.
So where does the quantum come into your process?
I help people understand who they are at a quantum level. And I think once people have an understanding of that quantum level, they start to release things that don't belong to them. Once I tell them how their cells work, once I tell them who they actually are, most of the time people are mind blown and say, you know what? Wow, I've been projecting all of this myself. And so it's a really exciting thing for me to watch in people. It's almost magic, really.
So essentially, as you educate people, they come to the realization of what is, and with that realization, then that becomes sort of the spark for them to make the changes they need in their lives.
Absolutely. And I've been coaching one gentleman for only 3 weeks, one time a week for an hour. And I have seen the most magical transformation that I've ever seen in my entire life. And so I realized that, what I'm doing here is an amazing thing for people. If I can just show them who they are, bring them back to themselves, because that's the part that's, people that are coming to me, they've lost their self a little bit, right? And so when they tell me their problems, and then I present them all back and ask, is this you? it's a great experience.
Yeah, and I think you're hitting on a key point that I'd like everyone listening to take to heart here is that, when we go through things like quantum life coaching or Reiki healing or any of the healing arts, right? Sometimes we look at these things as going outside of ourselves, right? To go find something to help. And frankly, there are people who go outside of themselves all the time to feel better or to find themselves. They're going to go take 2 years off and go explore the world to go find themselves, to see who they are, right? Or maybe I'm going to drink, or I'm going to use drugs on the other side of that, right? But there's something outside of us that is going to help us find ourselves. But the reality is you don't have to find yourself, because yourself, you are already complete. You are already there inside of you. It's less about finding yourself, and it's more about remembering who you are, right? I mean, it's because those layers that have been coded upon us by society and by our family, and even by we do it to ourselves, right? It's like a snowball effect. Once we hear those messages from others, like we just compound it, right? We just hammer it in ourselves with our thoughts and all that other stuff. And so it's a matter of chipping those away so that we can remember who we were before all of that stuff happened.
Absolutely. I mean, perfection. You said that in perfection. You're absolutely right. Everything that we need is inside of ourselves. And if you do need help finding that, that's completely okay. But everything does lie within. Absolutely.
Yeah, it reminds me of, I had a pretty intense, I call it a rebirth experience more so than an awakening back in July. And I had this massive download of information during that rebirth. And one of the messages that I got from the universe was, we are already whole as is. Everything we need is inside of us. However, sometimes we need a teacher to awaken what's inside of us. And that's not verbatim, but that's where someone like you comes in, right? So you're not giving anybody anything new that they don't already have. Maybe with what you teach people and what you share, you're awakening something in them that's been there the whole time. It's just been dormant.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, Amber, as it relates to quantum, like, what are some of the questions that you still have? Because, it is such a cool, topic or subject, and there's so much to it. People spend their entire lives studying quantum. Like, what are some of the things that you still look forward to seeing the universe reveal to you through this?
It's revealed so much, but even everything that I know that I don't understand even a fraction of it. The world is so vast, and our systems, our own body systems, they're so complex, and there's no way of understanding it all. So I really just look forward to the journey of what it is going to reveal, because I have no idea. I had no idea that quantum physics existed before that came into my awareness, right? I had no clue. So really, I just look forward to anything the universe has to provide, actually. Just anything it's willing to show me, I'm willing to look. Absolutely. And it's really exciting, because I had no idea 3 years ago I would be talking to you today. I had no idea I would be studying quantum physics. I had no idea I'd be coaching people. And it kind of all landed in my lap, and it's the most exciting time of my life. So I really just look forward to anything that it shows me.
Absolutely. And I can tell you folks listening in that I've had quite a few conversations with Amber, and she's the real deal. When you talk to Amber, you will learn so much about yourself that you knew already, but the light turns on when you speak with Amber. And so I absolutely highly recommend Amber if you're considering any kind of internal work. So, Amber, is there anything you'd like to promote? Is there anything you'd like to plug? How do people get a hold of you?
Yeah, the only place I'm at right now is on Facebook. You can find me at Amber Wippel, Quantum Life Coach. You can find me there. I'm highly accessible. If you even have small questions, I'm available to answer that at any time. So reach out. If you're going through a hard time, I encourage you to reach out. if there's anything I can help you with, absolutely, I'm more than happy to do so.
And if you're listening to this podcast on iTunes or Google Play or Spotify, if you visit SpiritWoke.com and you search for Amber Wippel, AmberWippel, you will find her podcast episode. And on that page where her episode lives, there'll be links to different ways that you can get a hold of Amber. So that's maybe an easier way for you to find her. And I'd love for you to check out the site anyway and see all of the other fantastic podcasts we have. But this is definitely an easy way to get a hold of Amber. So Amber, is there anything else you'd like to share with our audience before we close out here?
Yeah, I mean, I want you guys, all of you, to know you're powerful, you're strong, you're worthy. And I think sometimes we get lost in society and kind of forget that. And I think it's so important to remember your power, remember who you are. And once you remember who you are, you step back into your power and life starts getting a little bit better. So if anybody is going through a rough time, please know you're powerful, you're worthy, I love every single person on this universe. As we should, right? And if you need support, reach out, but just know that you're powerful and know that you're worthy.
Absolutely. And if you're just starting to go through that spiritual awakening process now and it's confusing and it's hard, Amber is a fantastic resource. And so definitely reach out to her. All right. Well, so with that being said, it's almost an hour already, and I'm sure you folks have stuff to do out there in listener world. So we're going to end today's show here. Amber, thank you so much for taking your time to spend with us. I can't tell you how appreciative I am of just your willingness to give.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate you.
The pleasure is all on this side of the microphone. Well, hey, until next time, family, be well and look forward to our next cast together. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks for listening to the SpiritWoke podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to check out our website, SpiritWoke.com, and connect with the SpiritWoke community on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Just search SpiritWoke. Join us next time for another edition of the SpiritWoke podcast. Namaste.